Welcome to this demand shifters video. Okay, so first you're gonna pause the video and think about this question. What could change producers' ability to produce? Okay, we're gonna have 4 shifters, so dump as many things as you can think of on your paper. Okay, so pause this video, dump as many things as you can think of. Okay, so as you might have guessed, these things are going to be supply shifters. So the supply curve, right, the whole curve, moves when there's a change in the producer's ability to produce. Okay, so we have, good A, whatever it is, okay? Right, if it's easier to make the product, then the supply curve shifts out. So S1, arrow out to S2. Okay, so always do a horizontal arrow, okay? Do it flat, okay? And then if there's something that makes it more difficult to produce, then the supply will shift in, or supply will decrease. So S1, arrow in to S2. Okay, always sideways arrows. Okay, so it's pointing at the smaller quantity, so supply is decreasing. Here it's pointing at the bigger quantity, so supply is increasing. Okay, so shifters. All right, first shifter is change in price or availability of resources. Okay, so hopefully this is one that was on your list because it is a pretty intuitive one to think of, so that's great. So change in price or availability of resources. Okay, so price of resource reflects its scarcity. Okay, so price and availability are kind of the same idea, right? So you can use either one. You can say change in price of resource, change in availability of resource. Either one's fine because it's the same idea. Okay, so the story could be, the resource price increased or the resource was less available than before, right? It doesn't matter. It's the same idea. Okay, so for example, if the price of wood increased, then price of wood decreased. So if the price of wood decreased, and wood is a resource for making houses, then it's now going to be easier to build houses than it was before. So supply will increase. Okay. All right. So make a list of any resources you can think of. Okay. So make a list of resources whose price changing would make a difference for the supply of a good. Okay, so go ahead and pause this video and make a list of resources. Okay, so when I see the note check, I should see what you came up with, not just what I came up with in this video, okay? So if you need to pause this video and list them out, do it. Okay. So some things to consider might be wood. Energy is an important part of a lot of production processes. Land, potentially, that one's okay. Machinery, right? So if the price of the machinery changes, then that changes their ability to produce. Metal is a resource used in a lot of production processes. And the most important one, but most often overlooked, is labor, right? So remember, labor, the worker's efforts, is one of your most important resources. And for most companies, their labor costs is their single largest resource cost. Okay, so a change in the cost of workers, right, a change in the workers' wages makes a big difference for the company's ability to produce. Okay, good. All right, next shifter, change in technology or innovations. I guess we do innovations. Okay, so change in technology or innovations. Okay, so this is going to be any change that makes it easier for the firm to produce. All the other shifters could go in both directions of making production better or worse. But technology improvements ideally would only ever improve production, right? Would only ever make it easier for production to happen. Though in theory it could go the other way. Like you could have an innovation that becomes widely used, but then it turns out to be really problematic, and that affects production. Or the new technology stops working, right, and then supply decreases. So you could think of cases where it decreases supply, but mostly innovations or technology increase supply. So can you think of what innovation made much easier to produce books? It was innovation made in the 1600s. Made it much easier to produce books. That's right, the printing press. Good. Yeah, the movable type printing press. Okay, so some examples of innovations and that had an impact on production and increased production in their market. Another one would be the cotton gin, right? So the cotton gin was developed because a particular strain of cotton had the seed that was really difficult to get out. And so the cotton gin was this tool to get this stubborn seed out, but that made it a lot easier to produce this kind of cotton, okay? Cranes make it a lot easier to build, buildings, right? Okay, so what this kind of story would look like would be, the printing press is invented, right? Or the cotton gin enters widespread use, right? So something about this innovation being new or being used widely for the first time, okay, those kinds of things would increase supply. If these things become cheaper, then that's a change in price of resource, okay? So if the innovation becomes cheaper, then that's a price or availability of resources issue. But if the innovation comes into use or it is developed, then that's a technology or innovation shift, okay? All right, number 3 is a change in taxes, subsidies, or regulations, okay? So these are government actions that affect production, okay? So taxes are money the company has to pay if it produces and sells goods, okay? Money that the company has to pay if it produces and sells goods, okay? You've probably heard of that before. So what you intuitively know about taxes is fine. Subsidy, though, is probably not a word you know. These are all key terms, but you probably know what taxes are. But subsidies, okay, and so you can pause this video or rewind it and listen to the definition again if you need to, okay? But subsidy is when the government pays a company pays the company a little bit when the company produces that good. Okay, so the government pays the company a little bit when the company produces that good. Okay, so a subsidy is a reverse tax. Okay, so with a tax, if the company makes and sells the good, they have to pay the government a little bit. With a subsidy, if the company produces and sells the good, it gets paid by the government a little bit. Okay, so it isn't making the good for the government. The good is being sold to a customer, right? But the government is giving the company that made it some extra money. Okay, so that encourages companies to make that product. Okay, and so we subsidize a lot of agricultural products like corn. We also subsidize things like solar panels. Okay, and those to encourage the production of those things. Okay, though that's kind of problematic because then we're taking resources away from making something else to make this instead. But that impacts the producer's willingness to produce. Okay, great. So let's unpack these. Okay, so if taxes increase, that decreases supply, right? Because the increased taxes means more of a burden on the companies, and so they're going to be less able to produce, okay? And more companies are going to go out of business because of that, okay? And then increase in subsidy, okay? That's, again, when the government's giving the company a little bit of money for having produced a product. That's going to increase supply, right? It's going to be more appealing for companies to make the product that's subsidized, right? Because they get a little bit of extra money from the government. So they feel like the production costs are lower, right? Whereas the tax made the company feel like the production cost was higher, okay? And then an increase in regulation, right? So we talked about regulations, okay? So how those are laws about how the company can produce or how it can interact with its customers, what it can make, how it can sell it, what sort of paperwork it needs to have, okay? So as we talked about before with economic freedom, having more regulation means that the company has to jump through more hoops, right? There are more laws about what the company is able to do or what kind of paperwork they have to fill out or how they can interact with their workers, okay? And that's just gonna mean more costs for the company to have to jump through those hoops. And okay, good. So that's increase in regulation. And so an increase in that regulatory cost is going to make it more difficult for the company to produce. Okay, sorry, there was something else I was going to say, but it's fine. Okay, so more burdensome regulations means lower supply, okay? And all of these go the other way, right? So less taxes would do what to supply? Yeah, supply would increase, okay? Because it's like the firm now has lower production costs, right? If the subsidy decreases or goes away, how does that affect supply? Supply would decrease, yeah, because again, it's like their production costs are higher, okay? If there were less burdensome regulations, what would that do to supply? Supply would go up, yeah. Okay, cool. Cool. Oh yeah, the other thing about regulations was that we'll watch a video about how many regulations there are in the US, but there are a lot. And so when a company is starting out or, trying to change what it's doing, they have to figure out if what they're doing is actually legal, right? Because there's so many laws, it's really difficult for them to know what's illegal and what's legal. And so they might have to hire lawyers to help them understand what the laws are. And even so, the lawyers don't necessarily know all the laws because there's so many, okay? But the more laws there are, the more of a burden that is on the companies. Okay, then, right, so for example, if there was an increase in taxes on car production, then that would decrease the production of cars. So S1, arrow in to S2, okay, production of cars decreases. Okay, so you're drawing all of these graphs in your notebook, right, and including all of the examples, okay, and anything that's important. You got this, team. Okay, last one. Elements of nature and political disruptions. Okay, this one is really fun, but also often misunderstood, so just be really careful with what's going on here. Okay, so this one's going to be a category of random weird stuff that happens that affects production. Okay, so all of these affect production. Okay, so if something goes on that doesn't affect production, it's not a supply shifter. Don't list it as a supply shifter. Okay, so that should be pretty obvious, right? But elements of nature, okay? So this one would be things like a flood shuts down factories, right? So that flood is a natural event, so we call it elements of nature, okay? But if the factories are flooded and the factories can't open, then obviously that impacts production, right? Could be, the fires that are happening in California that are shutting down a lot of factories or burning down factories or burning down crops, right? So all of those would be elements of nature shifts, okay? And then we have this bumper crop. Okay, so sometimes elements of nature are bad, but sometimes they're good, right? So sometimes the weather in a particular year is particularly great for growing a certain thing, and so you get what's called a bumper crop, where you get an unusually large yield of some crop because, the weather was really great for it, or the rain came at the right time, or whatever, okay? And then we have political disruptions, okay? Political disruptions. So these are political events that affect production, okay? So remember, if something doesn't affect production ability, then it is not a supply shifter, okay? So if a country goes to war, does that affect the country's ability to produce goods and services? No, right? It changes what goods and services we'll want to produce, right? We'd want to produce more war goods and less consumer goods, but it does not change our ability to produce goods, okay? So war would not, preparing for war, right, and producing more war goods and less consumer goods is not a supply shift. That's actually a demand shift, right? We're demanding a different kind of goods, okay? But the political disruptions are things that affect production, like interrupt production, okay? So like riots, right? If riots are destroying factories or the factories have to shut down or they're destroying businesses, then that reduces the ability of those businesses to produce, so supply shifts in. Okay. If workers go on strike, that's where they refuse to work, and then the company has to, or the factory has to close, right? And so that interrupts production. Or if factories get bombed, right? Then they have to stop producing, right? Good. So all of these impact production, right? So if war involves factories getting damaged, or if crops are getting burned down, right, then those would all be political disruptions, supply shifters, okay? My great-grandfather owned a factory in Paris prior to World War II, so he owned this factory as the Nazis were planning to come through Paris, and so everybody in Paris thought the Nazis were going to come through and just burn everything to the ground, okay? So my great-grandfather had this factory, and he thought, okay, well, I'm just going to sell it, right? And he sold it for next to nothing, right? But he thought, well, it's better to get, almost nothing for my factory than actually nothing if the Nazis go and burn it down, right? But if the Nazis actually had come and burned everything down, then that would have significantly impacted production, right? The supply of goods in Paris, okay? So that's a political disruption. All right. Cool. Great job, guys. Oh yeah, so if you watch a different video about supply made by someone who is not me, they might have different supply shifters, but these are the ones that you need to know and the ones that you should use. Okay, great job, team.